A single number sits at the center of this entire conflict, and that number is 2. Because for every Iranian ballistic missile launched toward Israel, roughly 2 defensive interceptors are required to maintain a reasonable probability of interception. And that ratio alone begins to expose a much deeper structural reality, which is that this war is not being decided purely on the battlefield, but is instead being shaped by industrial capacity, supply chain resilience, and the mathematics of production versus consumption. Because defensive interceptor systems are among the most complex and resource-intensive weapons ever built, requiring precision manufacturing, advanced sensors, guidance systems, specialized materials, and long production cycles that cannot simply be accelerated by political urgency. While offensive ballistic missiles rely on older, widely understood technologies that are cheaper, easier to replicate, and can be produced in significantly larger quantities, especially by a state like Iran that has spent decades investing in scalable missile production infrastructure. And what this creates is not a temporary imbalance that will correct itself over time, but a structural asymmetry where offensive output can be sustained and even increased while defensive capacity struggles to keep pace, meaning that over an extended period, the side dependent on interception faces an unavoidable depletion curve. And this is not a theory or a narrative shaped by media framing, but a straightforward mathematical constraint, which explains why the earlier short-duration conflict concluded not with a decisive strategic outcome, but at the point where defensive inventories were approaching critical depletion levels, forcing a pause before the system could no longer function effectively. And now in the current and far more prolonged confrontation, these same dynamics are re-emerging under even more challenging conditions, because the initial defensive stockpile, creating a compounding effect in which each exchange leaves the defender in a weaker position than before. And this produces a trend line that is not moving in a favorable direction for the defensive side, particularly when detailed information about inventory levels is restricted, limiting transparency and preventing a full public understanding of how rapidly resources may be diminishing. While on the operational level, the attacking strategy shows clear signs of deliberate planning and sequencing rather than improvisation, beginning with targeted efforts to degrade radar and detection systems, effectively reducing the eyes of the defensive network. Because when early warning capabilities are compromised, reaction time decreases, interception probability declines, and a higher percentage of incoming threats are able to reach their intended targets, which in turn increases pressure on remaining defensive assets. And this initial phase is followed by actions aimed at limiting aerial refueling capabilities, which are essential for extending the operational reach and endurance of combat aircraft, meaning that without reliable refueling support, aircraft cannot remain airborne for all extended periods or operate effectively at longer distances, thereby reducing the defender's ability to maintain continuous air coverage or conduct sustained counter-operations. And each stage of this sequence is designed to weaken a specific component of the defensive system while simultaneously amplifying the effectiveness of subsequent actions, reflecting a level of coordination and preparation that suggests long-term strategic planning supported by repeated simulations and analysis rather than reactive decision-making under pressure. And as the conflict continues to evolve, it becomes increasingly clear that its implications extend far beyond immediate military engagements into the broader global economic system, particularly through critical maritime chokepoints such as the Strait of Hormuz, through which a significant portion of the world's daily oil supply transits along with essential commodities including fertilizers, industrial inputs, and materials necessary for modern manufacturing and technological production, meaning that any sustained disruption in this corridor does not remain confined to energy markets but triggers cascading effects across multiple sectors, driving up costs in agriculture, constraining industrial output, and placing additional stress on already fragile global supply chains. And when these disruptions are considered alongside potential instability in adjacent maritime routes such as the Red Sea, the cumulative impact becomes even more pronounced, effectively transforming geographic choke points into strategic economic levers capable of influencing global markets in ways comparable to financial sanctions or currency-based pressure. And what adds further complexity to this situation is the observable difficulty in guaranteeing secure passage through these routes, even with the deployment of advanced naval capabilities, combined with the reluctance of other nations to commit additional resources or participate in joint operations, which signals not merely a temporary operational challenge but a broader recognition among international actors of the limitations inherent in projecting and sustaining control in such environments. And while the immediate risk of nuclear escalation remains relatively constrained given that Iran does not yet possess a fully developed and deployable nuclear weapon despite holding enriched material at significant levels, the longer-term strategic implications are far more concerning, because historical patterns consistently demonstrate that states lacking a credible nuclear deterrent remain vulnerable to external pressure, while those that possess such capabilities are significantly less likely to face direct intervention. And as a result, the experience of sustained military pressure combined with observations of past international cases is likely to reinforce rather than diminish the strategic incentive to pursue a complete nuclear capability, suggesting that a conflict initially justified in part as an effort to prevent nuclear development may instead contribute to strengthening the motivations that drive it. And this dynamic aligns with historical precedents such as where early assumptions of rapid success gave way to prolonged engagement after critical underestimations of an adversary's resilience, production capacity, and willingness to endure losses, illustrating a recurring pattern in which initial strategic assessments fail to account for the full complexity of the conflict environment, leading to situations where contingency planning for extended operations is insufficient or absent altogether. And in a similar manner, the expectation of a swift and decisive outcome in the present context appears not to have adequately accounted for the possibility of sustained resistance, leaving limited preparation for managing a prolonged conflict and no clearly defined pathway for achieving a resolution that aligns with initial objectives once those expectations prove unrealistic. Building on this trajectory, the broader geopolitical consequences of the conflict are becoming increasingly visible as multiple global actors adjust their positions in response to the shifting balance, with Russia emerging as a clear near-term beneficiary due to elevated energy prices and reduced enforcement pressure on its exports, allowing it to generate increased revenue without directly participating in the conflict itself, while China adopts a more cautious and calculated approach, avoiding direct escalation but positioning itself as a stable economic partner and potential diplomatic intermediary, preserving relationships across all sides while quietly expanding its long-term influence. And at the same time, European nations are signaling a noticeable shift in posture, showing reluctance to align fully with decisions that impose significant economic and political costs without clear direct benefit, which reflects a gradual reassessment of alliance dynamics and a growing willingness to distance themselves from strategies that are perceived as externally driven. And this evolving landscape highlights a deeper transformation in global power relationships, where traditional assumptions about unified responses and coordinated action are becoming less reliable. And within this context, the strategic pressure is not limited to military calculations, but is also being driven by economic strain, political constraints, and public perception, all of which are compounding over time as energy markets remain unstable, supply chains continue to experience disruption, and governments are forced to balance external commitments with internal economic realities. And this pressure feeds directly back into decision-making, narrowing the range of viable options and increasing the cost of delay. Because the longer the conflict continues, the more difficult it becomes to reverse its effects or return to pre-conflict conditions. This leads directly to the central unresolved question of how the conflict ultimately comes to an end. Because the available options each carry significant risks and limitations, with the first being an attempt to declare victory and disengage, which may appear to be the least costly path in the short term but is complicated by the gap between stated objectives and actual outcomes, making it difficult to present such a move as a credible success, while the second option of escalation, involving expanded targeting and increased intensity, carries the historical risk of hardening resistance rather than breaking it, as states facing what they perceive to be existential threats tend to absorb pressure, adapt their strategies, and respond in ways that impose additional costs on their adversaries, potentially widening the conflict rather than resolving it. And the third option of pursuing negotiations offers the most plausible path toward a durable resolution, but requires acknowledging realities that are politically difficult to accept. including the limitations of initial assumptions and the need to address underlying security concerns in a meaningful way. And as long as none of these options is decisively pursued, the conflict remains in a state of strategic drift, where actions continue without a clearly defined end state. And during this period, the underlying structural dynamics continue to operate in the same direction, with the imbalance between offensive production and defensive sustainability remaining intact, economic pressures continuing to ripple outward through interconnected global systems, and geopolitical alignments gradually adjusting in response to perceived reliability and long-term interests. And over time, this combination of sustained military pressure, economic disruption, and strategic uncertainty increases the likelihood that the final outcome will not be determined by a single decisive event, but rather by cumulative effects that reshape the environment in which decisions are made, ultimately producing consequences that extend beyond the immediate conflict and influence the broader trajectory of international relations in ways that were not fully anticipated at the outset.